Welcome, dear friends, and time for another strange Dartmoor episode. That weird place, a land with so many pixies, witches and weird folklore. Let's wander down the sunken Devon lanes and over the moors together, and let's see what we can find there. The Pixies of Sheepstor. Once, life on Dartmoor was much simpler, harder, but also simpler in need. It is and was a farming place in older times, though we worked at the pace of nature unforced, touching the ground and honouring the earth, understanding the things that we have lost the knowledge of. And the machines arrived and modern practices, and we lost a lot of our connection to this raw nature. We tried to dominate it and force it to bend it to our will. And so no wonder we don't see the pixies and fairies anymore in these places. We just glimpse something now and then that just is strange. We lost our respect, and at the same time we lost our second sight. There is a tale from Sheepstor, which is a strange place with a lot of scree and a lot of scramble to get to the top. And at the top a little bowl-shaped piece of land with shelter from the wind and weather, just for a while. Sheepstor is a pixie place. To this very day, locals will count as brave or foolish anyone who wants to camp there or squeeze into the tiny cave known as the Pixie Cave, if you are small enough, that is. Here, pixies were known to live in the caves, panning for Dartmoor's gold, found in tiny flakes in the little streams that crisscross the moor. These pixies were miners, digging into the earth to find the sun-like metal full of talismanic magic and power. As more humans arrived, an arrangement was made and a pact was sealed between the humans and the pixies to leave each other alone. A little food would be left by the pixie mines, and on the hearths, the humans would keep secret the location of the pixie mines also. The pixies would give a little help to the farmers as well, in return. Easy work for pixie magic, and this accord carried on for generations. Time passed and more people arrived to settle the moorland, and what was more precious now was water. A dam was constructed and many pixie dwellings and mines were flooded, pixie rings overcome by water, and no meeting grounds in some places. A wariness and a mistrust grew between pixie and human. The tales, though, remained and carried on, and these are the tales that I will tell you. It was dusk, and a farm worker was making his weary way over the Sheepstor part of Dartmoor. He was coming close to Isles Barrow Mine, when he began to hear voices that he knew should not have been there. He followed the sound and crept close to see who was making this strange sound. Above him the moon was bright, lighting the land with that strange white silver glow that lights every single blade of grass and brings everything into sharp focus. Coming into view now was a group of small creatures, picking away at the earth in a small quarry. He became almost hypnotised by the tap-tap-tapping of the little picks, the pick-pick-picking. One of the pixies stopped, suddenly stretched, and announced it was supper time. And like the human fool that he was, he opened his big mouth. Of course, he wasn't surprised they were ready for food, as he was too. And what are they looking for? And all together the pixies replied, "Tin." Now he grew a little cocky. If they were working so hard to dig for the master of the mine's tin ore, why not dig for gold instead? "After supper," they replied, all in one voice. Growing ever more confident, the foolish man spoke out of turn again. He would join them for supper as well, as he was starving hungry. What a fool! How many times do we read of never eating fairy food and being too familiar with fairy creatures? At this, a single pick swung through the air, and the huge man was swept off his flat feet and swept magically down off the tall hill and shoved deep in a hole in the ground. Now he found himself in a huge dining hall, and yet everything was teeny tiny, tiny plates, so small that many could fit in his hand. On these plates were all kinds of berries, nuts, and there were tiny bowls filled with golden honey. Oh, how his stomach growled. He frowned at the pixies all ready to feast there. There would never be enough for a single human man. Well, what about a cup of tea then? Around a fire, a crowd of pixies stood, tending an overly large kettle that wobbled left and right on its stand. The foolish man strode over to the kettle and stood on one of his own bootlaces, and went flying all the way towards the crowd of pixies and the fire and the wobbling kettle. The kettle now went flying too, tea spilling here and there and everywhere, washing all over the floor. Wasted tea. As one, the whole room of pixies stood astonished, and all as one, they gasped loudly, "No supper! No gold!" Enough was enough. They swarmed at the man with incredible strength. They picked him up and ran fast out of the hall, along the corridor and out of the hole. They chucked him out and he fell on the hard ground, into the gully where he had first seen the pixies, and the sun was just starting to peep over the horizon. He rubbed his bruises and sighed. No supper, no gold. Nearby Sheepstor many years ago there was a small farm, a small holding as we would call it today. Here lived a man and his wife, and honestly he was one of the unluckiest farmers around. His son had passed away in a dreadful accident. His cows never gave enough milk, his sheep struggled to survive. With an air of life couldn't get any worse, the man and his wife carried on. It was a day in autumn. The farmer had been mending fences. He was tired out and exhausted, cold and miserable. He fell into the kitchen, ate his meal and collapsed into bed. Around 2 a.m, the farmer woke to a strange sound. Someone was in the kitchen. Now, for those who don't know, Dartmoor has a prison, and the farmer worried that this could be an escaped prisoner from the prison in the middle of the moor. But as he listened, he could hear voices, small and high-pitched. It was Pixies. He knew where there was a crack in the bedroom floorboards where he could peep through into the kitchen below. He crept silently from his bed and crawled across the floor. There, in his very own kitchen, were Pixies, dancing and singing around on the table where the cups and the plates still lay. Now, heaven knows why he did this, and he had no idea himself either, but suddenly he had the urge to play a trick on them. He felt around in the dark for his work trousers and found the pockets, and in there was one of the staples from his fencing work that day. He poked it through the little gap and let it drop on the table, and it just missed one of the Pixies. They stopped instantly, shocked to their little cause, and then they fled into the night. Next morning the farmer went down to the kitchen, and all was as they had left it the night before. He shrugged. Was it a dream? He went into the barn to check on the drying hay that he cut a few days earlier, and yet all that was there was a burned pile of crisping ash. As he moved it around with his boot, he heard a chuckling sound and was astonished to see a pixie pointing at his feet. And when he looked down, there was the staple he poked through the hole. With a final "ha!" the pixie disappeared through the hole in the barn door. And after that he learned to have a little bit more respect for the Pixies. Each night the couple would leave some food and milk for the pixie visitors, and in the morning they would find acts of kindness in return done by the Pixies for him. Jobs were finished, tools were sharpened and rooms were swept. A silent pact had been made and kept. Another place near Sheep's Tor is an old mine called Kit Mine, once a working tin mine, Dartmoor being famed for its good quality tin. There was one foolish old miner though here who learned the hard way the consequence of stealing gold from the Pixies. The miner had taken a break from work to have a breather and a brew of tea. Despite him having stopped working, he could still hear the sound of a pickaxe somewhere tapping on rocks. But he was the only miner there. The other weird thing was the sound was coming from an abandoned mine below him. Curious now, he decided to investigate. He stuck a candle in his helmet lamp and headed into the darkness. Eventually he had to crawl in the wet along the tunnel, and as he got nearer to the sound, he found he was watching a pixie tapping away at the rock. The pixie hadn't even noticed that he was being watched because he was working so very hard. The miner noticed that at the feet of the tiny miner was a pile of shining ore. The miner knew that this particular mine at it had been closed because the tin was exhausted. So what on earth was this shiny metal? And why was it shining so much brighter than any tin that he had ever seen in his life? And he realised it was gold. And now the eyes of the pixie turned to look at the miner. In a flash, the little pixie fled into the darkness and left the human and the gold. The old miner was astonished, and then this turned to delight. Some of the nuggets were huge. He began to fill his pockets, chuckling all the while. Finally, his pockets were full, and he scrambled back down the tunnel to the mine shaft ladder. He began to climb the ladder, laughing at his good fortune and calling to his mates who were approaching. And in his clumsiness, his foot slipped on the wet ladder rung. He fell back into the hole, and as he did so, the timbers supporting this old part of the mine went with him. And then the granite as well. A rescue attempt was carried out immediately, but to no avail. He was gone. It was an impossible task. After this tragedy, the whole mine was closed. The Black Hen. Wandering on the west side of the moor long ago, travellers would come across a little meadow, and in the middle of this meadow was a site of a huge fairy ring. In this magical place grew the greenest grass. Emerald green, lush and smelling of a strange freshness, and nature at its most vivid. The villagers from nearby would speak in hushed tones of a strange black hen that would appear magically in the middle of the fairy ring on certain nights as the moon was full or new, a black hen and her little chicks. It was whispered that this hen had the tongue of a snake and eyes that glowed like red ruby fire. Where they came from nobody knew, nor who they belonged to. Other folk told that the hen drew the fattest worms from the fairy ring, long and fat as snakes, and these were her favourite feast. The local vicar was a very strange fellow. The villagers of his parish were very wary of him, because it was known that he had an unhealthy interest in black magic. Rumours had spread his bookshelves were crammed with books, and these books were all about witchcraft and dark arts and strange things. He was often seen walking around suspiciously during the dark nights. About on what business nobody knew, but all shuddered as they gossiped. It was a usual summer sunny Dartmoor day, a Sunday, when some clues came to light about the strange goings-on in the parish. The vicar was at church with the parishioners, and one of the servants, no doubt curious, slipped into his master's study. On the desk was a huge black book, leather-bound, imposing and ominous. The servant crept closer and read aloud from the book carefully with his simple learning. The sky began to darken as the servant spoke, to a dark, wicked Dartmoor slate grey, and from the tops of the moors a howling wind began to sweep down the valleys and towards the rectory. The storm grew in strength and viciousness. The house shook with the force of the gale. Terrified now, the servant gasped as the doors flew open, and into the room strode a black hen and her chicks. Before his eyes the hen and chicks began to grow in size as they walked around the study, and they grew and they grew and they grew until the hen was the size of a cow. At church, the vicar was proudly reciting his sermon to the church, filled with his parishioners. And suddenly he looked to the church window and glared. He turned back to his lectern, closed the Bible silently, stepped from the pulpit quietly, strode down the aisle, opened the large door, and walked through, slamming the door behind himself. The parishioners looked at each other, wide-eyed and shocked. It did not take the vicar long to reach his home and his study, and as he opened the door he found his servant whimpering and crying on the floor, crouched in a corner, praying for help. In front of the man, a black hen had grown so large that her head was now pressing against the ceiling. The chicks were now the size of cows. The vicar, exasperated, strode to a sack in one corner and grabbed a handful of corn which he tossed to the floor. The enormous black hen and her chicks began to peck at the teeny tiny to them seeds. Now the vicar squeezed past the giant hen and began to read from the black book. And little by little the hen and her chicks shrunk smaller and smaller, until eventually they were the normal size. And the servant, well, he was given a stern talking to and made to promise never to do likewise again, to mind his own business. And the parishioners, well, now they had another strange tale to tell about the vicar and to gossip about. The Ghosts of the Civil War at Chagford. The English Civil War was a desperate time for England, the mid-1600s, full of battles between brothers, fathers and sons, uncles and nephews, womenfolk and children likewise pitted against each other in hatred, where once respect and even love had been. No place was safe from this time of fighting between royalists and parliamentarians, the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. It was a time much romanticised by popular novels and poems, and yet the reality of the era is cruel, filled with desperation and despair. On the 8th of February in 1643, battle came close to the stannery town of Chagford. At the bottom of Providence Hill, where a bridge stands, over the River Teign, and near to Blackerton Brook, it is now known as Bloody Meadow. The battle was fierce and bloody. Many men were killed and many more were wounded. Local legend has it the bodies of the fallen were buried in nearby fields in the huge Devon banks that line the fields and the lanes here. On the anniversary of the battle, ghostly fighting can sometimes still be heard, horses' hooves beating the earth as men scream and shout, and the clatter of swords and armour rings through the air. It was this battle that saw the death of Sidney Godolphin at Chagford itself on the 9th of February at what is now the Three Crowns Hotel. Godolphin, a small man in stature, was a poet, recorded as a gentle soul, and a member of Parliament for Helston and Cornwall, and very passionate about fighting for the king. He refused an officer's commission, preferring to fight alongside other cavalry soldiers, the normal men of the parish. Towards the end of battle, Godolphin was shot by a musket ball and taken to the Three Crowns and laid on the stone bench in the doorway there for respite. It is said by some that after this he was moved to a more comfortable tower room of the inn where he passed away from his wounds, and other legends say that he died in the doorway on the stone bench. Whichever happened, he is buried in Okehampton Church in the chancel. He was only 33 years of age, and all of these places can be seen to this day. All of this area of the Bloody Meadow and the bridge feels very strange. It's a place my husband and I know very well, having many friends still in Chagford, and once at Gidley also. It feels a very liminal space, as though anything could happen in this in-between place. All of the area is also known as War Cleave, and opposite Blackerton House is a wall with a broken cross. Nobody really knows its age, but it could be the cross that was once by the village pond and noted as lying in a pond in 1872. There is also local legend that says that this cross was erected to commemorate those who had lost their lives at the Battle of Bloody Meadow. The soldiers would have been billeted around Chagford, the officers staying at Widden House, which is now the Three Crowns Hotel and Inn. In 1980, a chef named Jock Harding was at the Three Crowns and had a strange experience. He was standing in the bar area when, in his own words, the figure of a man came out, walked through a door to the corridor behind, but without opening it. The figure was a cavalier, with a classic plumed hat on his head, and he recognised the ghost as that of Sidney Godolphin. A Reverend Scott was once one of the rectors of Gidley Church, a man who much loved a tipple of gin, who often was heard to call it God's gift to man. Finding he was out on his heavenly drink, he decided one evening to walk from Gidley to Chagford, which isn't so far away, to pick up a new bottle to enjoy. As he returned home through the swirling mists of this little valley, he began to hear the thundering sound of horse hooves coming towards him. Convinced he was going to see the ghostly legendary battle, he leaped over a nearby wall and prayed for courage. Eventually he brought himself to peep over the wall and was greeted by a herd of horses who had expected him to give them their evening food. Have others heard the ghostly battle? Well, yes. This I know for sure because we have friends who know this place even better than we do because their families live or have lived there. And many of them have had strange experiences, and one family member of a friend even heard the echo of the battle. Clinton Scollard, a poet and writer living in the mid-1800s to early 1900s, wrote a poem dedicated to Godolphin and the Battle of Bloody Meadow. They rode from the camp at morn, with clash of sword and spur. The birds were loud and thorn, and the sky was an azure blur. A gallant show they made that warm noontide of year, led on by a dashing blade, by the poet cavalier. They laughed through the leafy lanes, the long lanes of Dartmoor, and they sang their soldier strains, pledged death to the Roundhead boar. Then they came at the middle day to a hamlet quaint and brown, where the hated troopers lay, and they cheered for the king and crown. They fought in the fervid heat, fought fearlessly and well, but low at the foeman's feet their valorous leader fell. Full on his fair young face the blinding sun beat down. In the morn of his manly grace he died for the king and the crown. Oh, the pitiless blow, the vengeance thrust of strife, that blotted the golden glow from the sky of his glad brave life. The glorious promise gone, and night with its grim black frown, never again the dawn, and all for king and crown. Hidden his sad fate now, in the sealed book of the years, few are the heads that bow, or the eyes that brim with tears, reading twixt blots and stains from a musty tome that saith how he rode through the Dartmoor lanes to his woeful dauntless death. But I, in the summer's prime, from that lovely leafy land, look back to the olden time, and the leal and the loyal band. I see them dash along, I hear them charge and cheer, and my heart goes out in song to the poet cavalier. The Dragon of the Moor. North of Holne Ridge can be found a little valley where a small brook tumbles playfully, and nearby is Coomstone Tor and Hexworthy village. Once a tinner's area, the land here is rich in ore. Many of the moorland sheep and wandering ponies can be found here, and the waters are a haven for bird watchers and those seeking a peaceful place to rest in nature. It is indeed an idyllic spot. Granite boulders and green or rust brown arching bracken, depending on the time of year. This is the Owe Brook, once known as the Ock Brook, although when and where it lost its sea, who can say or why. As lovely as this place is now, it was once forbidding and very frightening, because this place was once the home of a dragon. Back in time, moorland folk would avoid this place, walk miles even out of their way to keep themselves safe. Even the tin miners trod carefully here, and never would have dared to strike pick or rock in case the dragon arose. Sheep and cattle grazing in the area were easy feeding for this dragon, but even this was preferable to the beasts of the prey, humans, especially those who did not know the danger and travelled the moor alone. It is said that this dragon lived at a place of ruins that had once housed men from the Bronze Age, at the oldest settlement there. Walls still stood tall in some places back then, and the dragon could often be seen standing atop them, its red eyes scanning the earth for victims. No one can recall what happened to the beast in the end. Did some moorland folk rise up together and slay the deadly enemy, or did time take it as it does all living things? Our favourite Dartmoor folklorist William Crossing gave forth that the moorland folk went into the valley, caught it, tied it and drowned it in the river Dart. The tinners of Devon and Cornwall were many and plenty, and generations over hundreds if not thousands of years dug for tin in the rich west country earth. They believed that dragons would lead them to rich veins of silvery ore. Richard Carew, the Cornish antiquary who lived between 1555 and 1620, wrote of this superstition. Some say that on a still night you may see fairy exhalations issue out of such places, and some again that they see streams of fire to fall on them, which they call fiery dragons. The Pixie Riders. Anyone who knows Dartmoor knows well of its ponies, grazing gently on the wild tracts of moorlands, or even by the car parks where the grass is a little shorter and new shoots are able to peek through, or thundering in herds over the moors and clattering down the sunken lanes. They are truly an enchanting sight when you come across them. There are times during the Dartmoor night when ponies stampede, galloping willy-nilly all over the tops and down the valleys, and even though this seems such a random skittish thing to do, on closer look, is there a method in their madness? Maybe even being directed? It could well be that the pixies are on the loose and causing mayhem, and one type of pixie in particular, the pony riders. Over generations, farmers would tell of horses and working ponies gone wild with panic, running at breakneck speed for no apparent reason, and in the mornings these working horses and ponies would be found exhausted in their stalls and in the fields, unable to even lift a hoof to work, sweating and breathing heavily. And more evidence, elf-locks. The poor animals' manes and tails also strangely plaited and braided and looped, carefully constructed hoops that can be used as pixie stirrups and pixie bridles, and some so difficult to untangle by human fingers, on top of the exhaustion of the horse and the pony. Now, scoff all you like at those who believe in pixies, but there are many on the moor today who still very much do believe, and still have weird experiences, sometimes quite frightening. Summer is a time when the ponies are allowed to wander almost freely all over Dartmoor, and an eye is kept on where they are, and of course all the farmers know whose ponies are whose. This particular farmer sent a worker to gather one of his herds that were being kept in a field and bring them in. The young man found the ponies huddled together as if for comfort. He carefully opened the rickety old gate, which creaked as he did so, and at the sound the ponies' ears pricked up, nostrils flared, and as one they began to gallop. Here and there they sped around the enclosure, this away and that away. The lad looked on bewildered. And yet, as he looked with more focus, and as the ponies passed closer to him, he could see something very strange, because every pony had a rider, tiny, human-like, brightly dressed and laughing and shouting on the wind in small voices. The young man was having none of this. He stepped right in front of the path of the first rider and pony. He would stop this nonsense and save the ponies. But the riders simply stirred the herd right around the lad, to the other side of him, left and right, and now they were kicking them on even faster. The little Dartmoor ponies were in a panic now, hooves clicking against each other, foaming breath and snorting. Round and around the enclosure the ponies and riders sped, faster and faster, and were becoming a complete blur. The lad couldn't even focus on them anymore, they were that fast and quick. And then, at the far corner of the field, they all as one came to a sliding, sudden halt. He'd expected the worst, a pile of injured ponies. And yet no. All of the ponies were fine, exhausted, but fine. What he did see, though, were all of the pixies leap off the backs of the ponies at once, jump onto the wall and over the wall and disappear from sight, still shouting and screaming as they went. And then silence and stillness. The only noise was the ponies snorting and catching their breath, trembling from exertion and steaming with heat. He let the ponies recover and rest a little, and then gently began to coax them back to the safety of the farm. From that day, whenever the young man was asked about pixie riders, he would respond in a thick Dartmoor accent, "'Twouldn't the first time they pixies had been up to Thacky." Stephen's grave. Nearby Lower Godsworthy, near Petertavy, can be found a small grave marker on the edge of Dartmoor, a lone thing, solitary and with a sad tale. There are a few tales explaining the grave. Stephen's grave it is called. One tale tells of a George Stephens whose home could be found at Petertavy, to the eastern part of Dartmoor. It was here he met the love of his life, a local girl, a beauty, called Mary Bray. Now there are various reasons given for what happened next. She turned him down, betrayed him with another moorland boy. He wasn't good enough for the girl's parents. Whichever the cause, the effect was the same. The poor boy, heartbroken to his very core and seeing nothing left in his future to aim for, took his own life. There is a version of the tale whereby the lad took the life of his faithless love first by poisoning an apple she ate, and then he ate the other apples so they could always be together in the afterlife. Another tale tells that he killed himself only, consuming deadly nightshade gathered on the moor. All agree, though, that he passed from poisoning. William Crossing, our Dartmoor folklorist, says he found a George Stephens recorded who had lived at Petertavy buried on the moor outside of hallowed ground because of the cause of his death. So could this be him? Another folklore researcher, Hemery, found a John Stephens died in 1762 in the October of that year, but sadly he never recorded where he found the research. The famous Bray family of Dartmoor, living at Tavistock, where Mr. Bray was Reverend and his wife a noted historical novelist, and both fascinated by the folklore of the moor, also gave more meat to the bone of this tale, as it seems a member of their family was involved. The Reverend, and also folklore collector Sabine Baring-Gould, took their accounts and published a full account in 1901. So with the story now padded out with more fact, here is what we can learn. John Stephens lived at Godsworthy Farm with a Roger Chubb. It seems John was a servant of the farm and a good man. Mary lived nearby at Wedlake Farm with her parents Andrew and Mary. The two young people found each other, met and fell deeply in love, but John was only a servant. Her parents refused him as her betrothed. They would not allow this relationship to continue. The couple was split up. It was final. John was a broken man, his heart and spirit crushed, and the weight of disappointment and grief overwhelming. The day following the breakup was Tavistock Michaelmas Fair, and John decided to go and try and lift his mood. The poor lad shattered more as he saw his love with her parents there, and with them was another man. It was too much. The pain was intense. John called into one of the local Tavistock chemists. There he bought poison intended for killing rats, and this was how he managed to procure such dangerous poison. John took it. He then called to the home of a friend, a Mr. Corndy, who was the local barber. By now John was becoming quite ill. He had begun to be sick with the effects of poison. Rallying himself after being sick, he decided to make his way home to the farm. But tragedy once more. On his way home he encountered the Bray family also leaving the fair and heading their way home. Inexplicably, the Bray party and John decided to visit an area on the way back home called Raj, which is today a pretty holiday park, right by the river. Here he decided to take more of the poison, but could not find space or time to take it privately. On their ways home now, the Brays and John went their separate ways, at a place called Yelland Corner. It was around 10 o'clock at night when John reached the farm. By now he was ill again and very sick. Mr. Chubb immediately pulled saddle and bridle onto one of the horses and rode to fetch the doctor. Sadly, by the time the two men returned to the farm, John Stevens had passed away, and the look of him told the doctor immediately that the cause had been poison. Because of the state of poor John, he was hastily buried in a corner of a sheep field until the inquest could be held. And indeed the inquest was held, and the verdict, sadly, was the obvious one, passed at his own hand. But of course this meant he could not be buried in the churchyard in this era. At the time, this was a crime. At the inquest, instruction was given to bury John at the first 4 crossways near Broadmoor Corner, and this is exactly where we find the grave marker today. Close to Broadmoor Corner, a simple stone for a humble man, but at least a marker of his passing. It wasn't too long after John's death that his ghost was sighted at Godsworthy Farm and at Wedlake Farm, and all the lanes between. There were strange unusual rattlings, strange spectral noises, all terrifying those living at the farms. Reverend Dr. Jago of Tavistock was called in for an attempt to lay John's spirit to rest, and a local witness wrote down what happened next. But he appeared to the said Mary Bray after she had left her father's house, and went to the service in so much as she received injury as a pregnant woman, or as one looking for a child, and had a wound to the day of her death that she would not make known how she got it, nor what she had seen, but would not deny but she had seen something. I think what the witness was trying to say was Mary ended up somewhat out of her mind with distress, and obviously had some sort of physical effect from seeing the ghost of John Stevens. After all of this tragedy, Mary never married. She passed away on May the 3rd of 1816, aged 72, sitting in a chair at her brother's house. To this day we can still visit poor John's grave, as with Mary or Kitty J, a sad tale that has passed into Dartmoor legend and ensured these tragic people's stories will always be remembered with fondness and a kindness that they never received in their time. So, until next time, dear friends, please don't play with the fairy folk or the Pixies, or you may end up in one of my folk tales yourself.